Hilchas Korban Pesach Perek Shvi. Here the Rambam is going to speak about the halachas of Pesach Sheni. Now the basic halacha is that if you have Tmeim, the Pesach Rishon, so then these Tmeim are pushed off to Pesach Sheni. But there's a special din that if Reiv of the people that are coming to bring the Korban Pesach are Tmeim Mes, so then they bring the Korban Pesach Betuma. That's a special din, that this din that you push off the Pesach Sheni is only if they're miut. Masha'inkin, if the Reiv HaTzibur, the Reiv HaKol of the people that are bringing the Korban Pesach, as the Rambam Sun's tight choice, are Tmei Mes, so then they bring it by Pesach Rishon. Now that din only applies to Tmei Mes. And therefore, as a result of that, they can even go into the Azara, even though normally a tummy is also to go into Azara, and a tummy is also to eat the basar, but nevertheless, it's pushed off the whole concept of Tumah, and therefore they are able to go into the Azara and do their Korban Pesach. If there's Reiv HaTzibur Atmei Mes, but that only includes the Reiv HaTzibur Atmei Mes, they could do the Korban Pesach. Masha'in came the other Tmeim, someone that's a Zava, so they can't do the Korban Pesach because they aren't the heter of doing the Pesach by Korban Rishon when it was B'tzibur only applies to Tmei Mes and doesn't apply to those other tumas like Zava, etc. Neither V'yeldas. The Rambam later at the end of this period will mechadish that even though that the people that are Tmei Sheretz, for example, people that are Tamei from other tumas which are not Tumah Yitzim V'gufei, the Tumah which is a Tumah that comes through Negiah, see, even though they don't go into the category of making the Reiv HaTzibur Tamei, because when you want to be machal that you can have the Korban Pesach Berishin, it only depends if the Reiv HaTzibur Atmei Mesim, and also they'll never be mutter to go into the Beis Hamikdash Betuma, because Lepel that Tumah wasn't Hutra, wasn't Nitche Mitzad the Korban Pesach. But on the other hand, you could shech the Korban Pesach for them. That's a chiddush that the Rambam is saying that even though they're not included in the roiv of the people that are the Tmeim in order to establish that you could do the Pesach B'tumah, and they could also, the Rambam doesn't say it here, but the Rambam says it elsewhere, that you cannot go into the Beis Hamikdash like the Tmeim Mesim, but on the other hand, there's a special heter that they could be included in the Korban Pesach and they could eat the Korban Pesach even though they're Tamei. We'll learn inside. Perek Shvi. Rabim shahayu Tmeim Mes B'Pesach Rishon. There were many people that were Tmeim Mes B'Pesach Rishon. However, im hoyim miut hakol, if it was only miut hakol, is harei elu nidachim lePesach Sheni, which kisharat tmeim. The pashtus kisharat tmeim means like just all other tmeim. If they would be a rabbim which were tmeim or one tumah, so they would obviously be pushed off lePesach Sheni. So al derez the tmeim mes are also pushed off lePesach Sheni because they're not the roiv, they're only a miut. Avalim hoyu reiv hakol tmeim mes, shehoyu akenim a klishoris tmeim tumas mes. So Memela, it's impossible to bring the Korban Pesach. And it was either Reva Kolat Me'imes, or that it's the Klisharis or the Kehanim at Me'imes. So let's say the Kehanim at Me'imes. So that means it's impossible to bring this Korban Pesach without Tumah, because the Kehanim are going to have to go into the Beis HaMikdash. For a Kehan that's Tumah to go into the Beis HaMikdash is a Isser Koris. And you're going to be doiched that Isser, l'tzerich of the Korban Pesach. So since you're being doiched that Isser l'tzerich of the Korban Pesach, so who adin the other Tmeim, which are Tmeim Mes, could also be makar of the Korban Pesach. That's what we're saying. Avalim hoyer reva kol Tmeim Mes. Oy shahoyo akenim, either the kenim with Tmeim Mes, oy klisharis, which the klisharis are Tmeim Mes, and therefore the kenim that are going to touch the klisharis are also going to become Tamei Tumas Mes, because the klisharis are either an av or an avi aves, if it's cherev areo kechol, but I'll call upon them the kenim that are going to touch this klisharis are definitely going to become Tumas Mes. So then it's Einan Nidachim. Then you don't push off the Korban Pesach to the Pesach Sheni. Elo yakrivu kulan ha-Pesach b'tumah. Everyone is makriv the Pesach b'tumah. Ha-Tmeim imaterim. Shene'amar v'hi anosh ma'shoyel l'tmeim l'nefesh adam. So we learn out of din yichidim nidachim. That only the yachid is nitcha l'Pesach Sheni. Aber v'eina tzibur nitcha. The tzibur is not nitcha. What does the tzibur mean? So either the tzibur means that if the roiv ha-tzibur are tmeim mes, so they're not nitcha, and or it means that lepeil, even the Reva Tzibur is not nitcha, but lepeil, if you're going to be doichem mitzat tumas mes, so no one will be able to bring the Korban Pesach because the kenim atome or the klisharis atome, so that would be matcha the Reva Tzibur. So therefore we say yechidim nitchem ve'enat tzibur nitcha, V'davar zeh betumas hames bilvat, k'mi shebiyane bebias hamigdash. Masha'enkin sh'ar tumas, they don't go into this gather that if Reiv Atzibur Atmeim, so then you're going to push it off, you're going to do it betumah. There's this musik that the Pesach Rishon, if Reiv Atzibur is Tomei, you do the Pesach Rishon, is only legabi tumas mes. Legabi other tumas, this din doesn't apply. That's din number one. That's din number one. And the pale mamish, when the Reiv Atzibur is a Tmei mes, and therefore everyone does it betumah, but that only applies to the Tmei Mesim, not to the Zov. And the Zov is like the Rambam say Bamsh. Halacha beis. Hayu akol. So if Reiv Atzibur is Tmeim, so then everyone does it betumah. If Reiv Atzibur is Tcheirim, it's only Miut Atzibur is Tmeim, so then the Tmeim are pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Now what happens? Halacha beis. Hayu akol mechzu Teirim and mechzu Tmei mes. It wasn't Reiv either way. It was mechzu mechza. So here there's a din that Kula Mesim Barishin, that the Tmeim do Berushin as well, because they're not a Yechidim. Yechidim are Nitchel Pesach Sheni. But the Mechza don't have a din of Yechidim. But V'hateidim Oisun La'atzmim B'tar. Over here there's a special din that since it's not a Reiv, if Reiv Atzibur are doing Berishin, Reiv Atzibur are Tmeim, so then everyone does it together, side the Tmeim, side the Teirim. Masha'enkin, if the Mechza are Tmeim, so on one hand the Mechza is allowed to do it because because it's a mechza, they're not nitchel Pesach Sheni. But on the other hand, since they're only a mechza and they're not a reiv, so therefore the mechza of Tehirim cannot be starved to the Tmeim to become tummy as well. Nachamo. How you are called mechza Tehirim or mechza Tmeim es? So then kula mesim berishin, everyone does the berishin side the Tehirim, side the Tmeim. However, v'hat Tehirim oisim la'atzman betara. The Tehirim are going to have to do things la'atzman betara, v'hat Tmeim oisim la'atzman betuma. And the oichel neisi betuma, and the tmeim oichel betuma. V'im hoyu tmei hames oitma la teherim afilu echad. If there's a majority of tmei hames, so then you also call him betuma. That's the difference. By mechza or mechza, so everyone could do it, but this one does the betara, this one does the betuma. Masha'enkin, when it's rubam tmeim, so then the teherim could also be mitzarefin with the tuma. There's no problem with the teherim becoming tummy and the basi becoming tummy. The whole musig of tuma we're not worried about at that point in time when it's rubam tmeim. Now the Rambam says this din b'negei hoya kol mechza terim mechza tmei mes. In Rambam Aruch he brings a tesis that over there from tesis meduyik that din is only another this din that if reiva kol were tmei mes the tehirim could be mitzaref with the tmeim and yasu kulim betuma is only when reiv hakol were tmeim. What about in a case where we had another case where the kohenim with the klisharis were tmeim, the klisharis or the kohenim were tummy? So over there he brings from the tesis that in such a case also the Tehirim shouldn't become Tomei, because Lepel the Reva Kol aren't Tomei. So over there, even though you do the Korban Pesach, but nevertheless the Tehirim should do Betara. They should do it Betara. They should remain Torah. That's what he brings from a tesis. But the Pashas Lashon Rambam say over here, where the Rambam writes that B'negei Yakrivu Kulim Kol HaPesach B'tumah and Al Derech Zeh the Rambam B'Yas Migdosh seems to be Atmeim Materim seems to be that the Rambam is putting it together with the case of Rubam Tmeim. Is Nachamol. So there's three Eifanim. There's an Eifan of Rubam Tmeim that you do with Kulam B'tumah, and then there's an Eifan of the Kenim Tomei, the Klisharis Tomei, and then there's a Tzir of Mechzal Mechza. By Mechzal Mechza it's clear that over there the Tmeim should do B'tumah and the Teirim should do B'tar. When the Ger Reiv it says that they could do it together and Mamela Yasu Kulam B'tumah. When it's the Kalim or the Kenim, so we're saying that there's a tesis in Pesachim that says that over there also the Tehirim should do B'tara. Sheikh in Pashas Lashon Rambam seems to be that over there also the Tehirim could be mitzaref with the Tmeim and the Yasu Kulam B'tumah. Halachi Gimel. Now this is Hoyu Hu Anoshim Mechzet Tmeim Mesu Mechzet Tehirim. The Anoshim, if you count the Anoshim that are here to bring the Korban Pesach, so it's Taka Mechza or Mechza. However, bizman shatamena hanoshim b'chlal hanoshim, so then it'll be you harev tehirim. So then the rev is tehirim. So now when you're counting on the beginning of Pesach, so before an erev Pesach, so if you only count the anoshim, they're half. The half are tmeim. If you count the noshim as well, so the tmeim are a miyut. So the din is hatohirim eisen surishin. The tehirim obviously eisen surishin. However, the tmeim which are a half. Is Einon Eisen Leis Arishim Leis Hasheni. There are half of the Anoshim Einon Eisen Leis Arishim Leis Hasheni. Ein Eisen Rishon, why? Because since in Pesach Rishon, the Noshim are Mechuyev, so male, if you count the people that are Mechuyev and that are here to bring the Korban Pesach, they're only a miyut. Is the Ein Eisen Rishon Pnei Shein Miyut. However, Vein Eisen Sasheni, they also can't do the Sheni, L'chura they're a miyut, because Shanoshim B'Sheni Rishus. So male, when they come to the Sheni, so they're not, V'nimtzu Atmei Mechza, Vein Mechza Eisen Sasheni. There's the whole musig of Eisen Sasheni is only when you're a miyut. So only when you're a miyut can you be Eisen Sasheni. So this Mechza, when it came to Pesach Rishon, they were a miyut, and therefore they couldn't do the Pesach Rishon. Because only a Reiv Tzibur could do the Pesach Rishon. Where a Mechza could also do the Pesach Rishon. But they weren't a Mechza, they were a miyut. And on the other, when they come to Pesach Sheni, they also can't do, because only a miyut is nitchel the Pesach Sheni, and in the Pesach Sheni, they don't have a din of a miyut, because the Gabe Pesach Sheni, we disregard the women, because the women aren't mechuyev Pesach Sheni. So they're no longer a miyut, so only a miyut is nitchel Pesach Sheni. So when it's mechza al mechza of men, and the women are also there, and therefore they're tahirim, so then the tmeim can't do labor Pesach Rishon, labor Pesach Sheni. Halacha dalet. Hoyu reiv hakol zovim u'mitziroim u'be'eli nidus. You have a mitzvah where reiv hakol are zovim mitziroim u'be'eli nidus u'mi'utam tmei emes, and a mi'ut of the kol are tmei emes. So the din is einam oisim tmei emes is einam esim berishin that's partial of fish mi'ut. And the zovim mitziroim u'be'eli nidus obviously also not do berishin because b'chlal by them there's no musig of tchiyah. So meil einam esim berishin of fish mi'ut. And also these Tmei Emes are Ein Eisen Hasheni. Why? Because there's a new rule. She'ein hayechidim Eisen Hasheni, ela bizman she'asu reiv hakol harishon. You can't, the musig of yechidim doing the Sheni is only when reiv hakol did the rishon. V'kan, heil v'lei asu reiv hakol b'rishon. Because the Tmeim, the people that were Tehirim were only a miyut, they were only a miyut. Lei asu reiv hakol b'rishon, or maybe it doesn't even mention the people that did the rishon. But al kol param, certainly not reiv hakol did b'rishon. Reiv hakol were zov mitzirois, we didn't do berishin. So memele liyasu elo amiyut hatmeim lemes is Hashem. So it's a new din. Normally the din is when you have a miyut of tmeim mes, they're pushed off l'sheni. Masha'en came over here, since that's a normal din. Masha'en came over, but normally the reiv of the people which are toirim bring berishin, and memele and the miyut which are tmeim mes they bring b'sheni. Mashenkan over here, the Reiv didn't bring Berishin because they were Zovim Zovis Meir. They couldn't bring Berishin. And the Tmei Mes also couldn't bring Berishin because they were a Miyat. So they didn't do Berishin because they were a Miyat, and they don't do B'Sheni because there was no Reiv that did Berishin. It's a new halach. Now the Maisa says the Rambam doesn't mention what happens with the Zov Mitzirah Mibayel Nidus. He speaks about the Tmei Mes. Liyasu Elo HaMiyut. The Rambam finishes off halacha dal. Liyasu Elo HaMiyut HaTmei Lemes is Hashem. So the Emes, the Mefarshim asked that l'chura, there's another reason why the Tmei Mes don't do the Sheni, because Lepel, there's a rave of Klal Yisrael that needs to do the Sheni, including the Zov Mitzirah Mebeil Nidus. And in Mela, there's a rule that before we said even Emachza is not Oisen Sasheni. And here, l'chura, the rave certainly is not Oisen Sasheni. So there's a rule that ain't rave Oisen Sasheni. So why do you have to say that the reason why the Tmei Mes are not doing the Sheni is because there was no rave that did the Rishon? Typically, they can't do the Sheni because together with them there's also the Zov Mitziroim, and that's a rave of Klal Yisrael, and they're not Eises Hasheni. That's a kasha that they ask. And on that they answer, we bring a teretz, that the pshat is that over here we're talking about not really such a glata teretz, l'chura. They were talking about in a case where the Zov Mitziroim are not coming along. It's a mod nezach. I mean, the Ram, like the whole time we're not mentioning this concept, they're not coming along, l'chura. The Rambam is not mentioning anything about the Zov Mitziroim. In Lepel and Gemara it says that there's a rule that ein reiv oisin is Hasheni. There's no musig of a reiv doing a Hasheni. The Rambam doesn't mention it. The Rambam seems to be only talking about the reason why the Tmei Mes are not going to do the Sheni is because since there was no reiv that did the Rishon, therefore the Tmei Mes can't do the Sheni. We'll get back to this again. Halacha hey. Now hoyer reiv hakol Tmei Mes u'miyuton zov mukeyitzibam. So now Tmei Mes Eisen Rishon, because they're Reva Kol, Tmei Mes, they do the Rishon. And V'hazov Nukiyetzeben is Einem Eisen Leis Rishon Leis Hasheni. Why? Einem Eisen Rishon because Shein Nitchus B'tzibur. Eller Tumas Mes Belvad, like we mentioned before. The whole musig of doing B'tzibur, the Tchiyah B'tzibur, to do the Korban Pesach is only Tumas Hames. But the Zavim Zavis are not Nitcha. And also, the Einon Eisen B'Sheni, why can't they do B'Sheni? They were Tmeim and they could do B'Sheni. So there's a new rule. Ein Eisen Pesach Sheni, Elim Bo Harishin B'Tara. Aval Nas Harishin B'Tumah Ein Shem Pesach Sheni. So this is a second rule. That the rule is that when do you make a Pesach Sheni? Only if Bo Harishin B'Tara. Masha'enkin if Bo Hasheni Harishin B'Tumah, so then there's no Pesach Sheni B'Chlal. Loshen Aram is Ein Shem Pesach Sheni. There's no Pesach Sheni. Pashas had Loshen is that even for someone who's Derech Rechek, and not only for Tumah, anyone that didn't do the Pesach Rishon, so if the Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tara, so then there's a Pesach Sheni for the Tmeim, so to speak. The Ikah of the Pesach Sheni is for the Tmeim. Masha'enkin, if the Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tumah, so then the whole institution of the Pesach Sheni was only when the Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tara. So then there's a special case of you have a Pesach Sheni for the Tmeim. And the Vaila also, the people that were Derech Recheka or whatever. Masha'enkin, in a case where the Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tumah, so there's no institution of Pesach Sheni. That's the second rule. So we had one rule that that this Pesach Rishon is only, the Pesach Sheni is only when Osir Reva Kolas Rishon, that's the number one, that it has to be Osir Reva Kolas Rishon. And now we're learning that it has to be that the Pesach Rishon was done B'Tara. B'Tara. Masha'enkin, if the Pesach Rishon was done B'Tumah, even though Reva Kol Osir Rishon, but if it was done B'Tumah, so then there's no Musig of Pesach Sheni. Halacha Vav, Hoyu Shlish HaKol Te'erim, Ushlish Zov Mukiyetzim, Ushlish Tmei Emes. So then the din is l'chura. These din is l'chura built on what we learned till now. Is eisen tmei mes ein eisen sarishon v'leis Hashem. Why? Ein an eisen rishon sharehim uatim legabi teirim mazov. Since they're a miut, they're not only a miut of the people that want to bring a Korban Pesach or shachas to bring a Korban Pesach. So therefore they're considered, since they're called a miut, so therefore they can bring the Korban Pesach. So that's they don't bring the rishon. Ubishein eliyasu. Why? Shaharei miut asabarishin. There was only a miut asabarishin, and the Ram already the Ram said already in Halacha Dalet over there was talking about Reva called Zov Mitziroim. So when the miut was asa isarishin, so b'chiyai gavna you don't do a Pesach Sheni. So we learned. Let's make a sikum. We learned that the halacha in the first three halachas we're talking about the negei tmei emes, that if Reiv of Klal Yisrael were tmei mesim, so then you bring the Pesach Rishon Tmei Mesim, you bring it B'Tumah. If it wasn't Reiv, you don't bring it B'Tumah. That's din number one. And that din also applies if the Kenim or the Klisharis with Tmei Mes, so also that causes that you should be able to bring it B'Tumah. Now what happens if it was Machza al Machza? So then again, you bring it B'Tumah. But on the other hand, even if it was Machza Tmei Mesim, but on the other hand, if it was Machza Tmei Mesim, so the Teirim have to do it B'Tara. Masha'enkin, if it was Reiv Tmeim Mesim, so even the Teirim could mix with the Tmeim and do it also B'Tumah. And then there was another din, what happens if it depends if you count the Noshim or not. Without the Noshim, so they're half and half, the Anoshim. Masha'enkin, if with the Noshim, they're only a miut. So Mimela, they can't do Berishin because they're only a miut, because in the Berishin, the Noshim are counted. Masha'enkin, the Sheni, they also can't do it because the Gabi the Sheni, they're not a miut. The miut could be pushed off the Pesach Sheni. Masha'enkin, the Gabi the Sheni, they're a half. And if they're a half, so they can't do the Sheni. That was the first three dinim when they get Tmei Mes. Now the Rambam, next three dinim, talks about the dinim of Zovim, when Zovim are mixed in. So now there's another din, that if Reva Kol were Zovim, so then, and the miut there was a miut of Tmei Mesim, so the din is that the Tmei Mesim can't do B'Sheni. Why? Because there's a new halacha. The halacha is that when Reva Kol Asu Berishin, so then there's a din of a Sheni. Masha'enkin, if Reva Kol didn't do Berishin, then there's no din of the Sheni. There's no din of the Sheni. That was the halacha Dal. And then halacha Hey, the Rambam said another din, that if the Reva Kol did it B'Tumah Berishin, so then the Nidus and the Tmei Mesim, they can't do B'Sheni, because there's another halacha. The halacha is that in order to do B'Sheni, it has to be that the Rishon was done B'Tara. So there's two din. First of all, the Rishon has to be done Reiv Tzibur has to do B'Rishon in order to have a Sheni. And another din is that the Rishon has to be done B'Tara in order to have a Sheni. Masha'enkin, if the Reiv with Tzibur with Tmei Mesim, and now the Zovim want to do B'Sheni, so then they can't do B'Sheni because the whole institution of Pesach Sheni is only when the Rishon was done B'Tara. If the Rishon wasn't done B'Tara, so there's no din of Pesach Sheni. That's the three halachas that we learned here. That's until halacha Vav, the middle of halacha Vav. Now we mentioned that the Sayin halacha Dalet, when the Reiv HaKol were Zovim Mitziroim Boiling Nidus. So he says that the Tmei Mesim don't do B'Sheni. Why? Because Li'oser Reiv HaKol Berishin. That's what he says. Since Li'oser Reiv HaKol Berishin, so therefore the Tmei Mesim don't do Berishin. Al Derev Zeh and Halacha Vov, again, there's a Maisa with the Shlish HaKol, Teirim Shlish Zovim. So again he says the Tmei Mesim don't do the Rishon because they're a miut, and they also don't do the Sheni. Why? Because Shari miut also Berishin. But the Rambam is only talking about the Tmei Mesim. The Rambam is not addressing in Halacha Daled or in Halacha Vov the Zovim and Mitzirayim. So there's a makom to say, which is a Chiddush. Pashas in Gemara comes out that there's no musig of a rave doing a Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni could only be a miut, not a rave. But the Lashon Rambam is meduyik that this din applies only to Tmei Mesim. That's what the Rambam says at the end of Halacha Daled. Liyasu elo amiut hatmeim lemesed hasheni. This din that you could only do the Pesach Sheni if the rave did the Pesach Rishon is a din in Tmei Mes. It says Tmei Mes, where over there's a musig that if they would be rave Tmei Mes, so then they could have brought the Pesach Rishon. So now we're saying Al Kol Panim the din would be, and over there that's the limud that the Tmei Mes, where the rave didn't do the Rishon, they can't do the Sheni. Masha'in came. It doesn't say that when the rave didn't do the Rishon, there's no Pesach Sheni. It doesn't say in Lashon Rambam in Halacha Hey over there it says Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. Masha'in in Halacha Dali it doesn't say Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. Over there he says Liyasu Elo Amir Tatmeim Lemasas Hasheni. So it means the Tmei Mes, the Sachidush, would be Meduyik in Lashon Rambam that the Tmei Mes can do the Sheni, but the Rambam doesn't say that the Zovim and the Mitziroim, which were rave, can do the Sheni. So it will come out of Sachidush that if you have a Metzias of people that were Torah, even they were mute, let's say, and then there was a rave of people that were Zav Mitziroim, so these Zav Mitziroim could do the Sheni, even though there wasn't a rave that did the Rishon. So this din doesn't apply to Zav Mitziroim. So the Pshat is not the Rambam says, brings from others, that with Halacha Dal is talking a case with the Zavim don't want to bring the Pesach Sheni. They're not coming to the Pesach Sheni. And Memela, so it's not a problem of the rave. There's no rave that want to do the Pesach Sheni, and therefore there's only the Tmei Mes don't want to do the Pesach Sheni, and therefore you have to come on to this din because Li'oser Reiv HaKol Berishin. It's like very dochuk in Lashon Rambam. But L'chura, the Pashtus Lashon Rambam is that this whole din is a din of Tmei Mes. There's been again, it's a Chidush, which is brought down this Chidush. That in other words, this whole din, both Stodim, because we're having a din over here that you cannot bring the Pesach Sheni unless the Reiv brought the Pesach Rishon. That's din number one. And then there's a general din that a Reiv can't do the Pesach Sheni. Generally, a Reiv can't, even a Mechza can't do a Pesach Sheni. So l'chura, a Reiv can't do a Pesach Sheni either. But from this, when Negeh Zav Mitziroim, it doesn't apply. That all applies to Tmei Mes. Tmei Mes. By a Tmei Mes, there's a din that even a Mechza can do the Pesach Sheni. Certainly, a Reiv can do the Pesach Sheni if they were Tmei Mes. By Tmei Mes, they would do the Pesach Rishon. Masha'inkin Benegeh Mitziroim will say, even if there was a miyat of Klal Yisrael that were Torah and a Reiv of Klal Yisrael that were Nidus or Baal, the Zav Mitziroim. So that was a Reiv of Klal Yisrael. So then, Lefi will come out that they are allowed to do a Pesach Sheni. They're allowed to do a Pesach Sheni. In other words, there's two inyanim. First of all, lay also hareiv bePesach Rishon. That's the reason why they shouldn't be able to do Pesach Sheni. And then there's another reason that they're the reiv. So how could they do the Pesach Sheni? Ein hareiv eisa Pesach Sheni. Before we said even ein machzah eisa Pesach Sheni. Lefi this chiddush comes out that all these dinim only apply to Tmei Mes. Masha'inkin, when you're dealing with Mitziroim, so it doesn't apply. By Mitziroim, they do Pesach Sheni. So in Halacha Hey over there, he says, Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. There's Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. Because if Bar Rishon B'Tara, Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. That's in Bar Rishon B'Tara, Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. Masha'in came, if we're dealing over here in a case, I'm sorry, if there's Leibar Rishon B'Tara, if the Bar Rishon B'Tumah, so then Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. Over there it says Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. Over here it doesn't say Ein Shom Pesach Sheni. L'chura, in this case of Hoy Reiv HaKol Zavin Mitziroim. So l'chura, the way they learn B'Pashtus, it comes out that nobody can do it. Nobody wants to do it. In other words, if everyone wants to do it, no one will be able to do it. Because Lepel was only a Miyad B'Pesach Rishon. The way we're saying comes out like this. This whole din, there's two dinim over here. One din is that in order to do B'Pesach Sheni, you have to have that the Reiv did B'Pesach Rishon. That was din in halacha dalit, because since ena yichidim eisen sa Pesach el bezman she'oser reiv hakol harishon. That's din number one. And the second din, that you ena harev eisen sa sheni. All of this applies only to Tmei Mesim. Masha'enkin Zov and Tziroim are not in that cloud, and over there, even if the Reiv didn't do the Pesach Rishon, they could do the Pesach Sheni, and even if the Reiv Atzibur, they could do the Pesach Sheni. All of these dinim don't apply only to Tmei Mesim. It's a chidush. But l'chura, that's meduyik mamish and Loshen Rambam, because the Rambam doesn't mention anything about the problem of the Zov and Tziroim in Pesach Sheni. Continuing Halacha Vov. Now, Ketzad Mishar in Pesach, Leda im Reva Kol Tmeim Eteirim. You're saying there's Reva Kol Tmeim, Reva Kol Eteirim. How do you measure Reva Kol? Is a Mishar in B'chol Eichel, all the people that are going to eat the Korban Pesach. She'ef she'shiyu esim nimnim al Pesach echad, u'mishal chenei b'yad echad. There's one person coming along with the Korban Pesach, and he's really representing 20 people, so that we don't count those people. Mishal chenei b'yad echad lishchet aleim. El Mishar b'chol ha'nechnasen la'azor. The people that are coming to Azor to bring a Korban Pesach. In other words, you can have one person representing a lot of people. You can have a number of people coming together with their Korban Pesach. But we're only counting the people that are coming to the Azor with their Korban Pesach. And so there's like a big line in the Beis Hamikdash, and everyone's waiting to go in with their Korban Pesach. There was the 3 kitas, and there would be 3 kitas, and they're all waiting outside. So there, when you count that people are tamei, so if rave of those people are there that are tamei, so they have the din of tumah and etc. etc. So which was interesting, which is brought out. People ask the question that l'chura, it comes out that the tmeim also came to do the Korban Pesach. In a normal situation, you would assume a person is tamei, so he assumes he can't bring the Korban Pesach. How does he know that Gans Klal Yisrael is tamei? Unless they know that there was an episode that happened that most of the people became tamei, or many people became tamei. Maybe there'll be a rave of tmeim, and therefore they'll be able to come. But that really explains only the Tmei Mes, why the Tmei Mes would come. But the Rambam is also talking about a case where the Zovim and the Mitziroim and the Be'eli Nidas, they're also part of this Reiv. And they're making a decision whether the Tmei Mes are Reiv or not Reiv. The question is, why are they coming to bring the Korban Pesach? L'chura, they're for sure not going to bring the Korban Pesach, Berishin. So l'chura, it's a little bit tzarek beer. I mean, the Rambam is saying you're only counting the people that are standing outside in the Azor bringing the Korban Pesach. L'chura, the Zovim Mitziroim are not bringing a Korban Pesach, because they know that either way they're not going to bring a Korban Pesach today. So what are they standing outside with a Korban Pesach? Basically. Halacha Zayin. Yochid shenitma b'sofik rishus hayochid. A yochid that became Tommy b'sofik rishus hayochid. The din is the sofik rishus hayochid is sveki Tommy, k'mishi is borbim kemei. So the din is hareze yudocha lepesach sheni k'shar tmeimas. So in the sense he's Tommy, so it's sveki Tommy, so memela is yudocha lepesach sheni k'shar tmeimas. Now, the tzibur shenitma b'sofik rishus hayochid, a tzibur that became tamei b'sofik rishus hayochid. So the entire tzibur is tamei with a sofik rishus hayochid. So the din is yasa kulam b'tumah. They should all do b'tumah. Now, the question is, what does it mean that tzibur shenitma b'sofik rishus hayochid? Does it mean that everyone had their own sofik, and now all together there's a tzibur of people that each one had their sofik rishus hayochid? So then Yasa Kulam Betuma means they all do Betuma, and L'chor means also Gans. Everyone does Betuma because it has a din of Revat Tzibur Betuma. Yasa Kulam Betuma is the Kulam going on this Revat Tzibur, or Yasa Kulam means everyone, Gans Klal Yisrael. The pastors L'chor is Gans Klal Yisrael, does Betuma. Now the question is, the Rambam, the din is Sofik Tuma B'Shus HaYochid Sveki Tuma, and it has a din of a Tami Vadei. But the Rambam Paskins, in Avesa Tumah, the Rambam Paskins that this din, that Sofik Tumah B'Shus HaYochid Sveki Tuma, and has a din of a Vadei, is only Midrabon. Midiraisa, he doesn't have a din of a Vadei. Midiraisa, he has a din of a Sofik. So the Chura, since he's a Sofik, so the question is, if each one has its own Sofik, we don't really know that Rev Klal Yisrael were actually Tamei. Mele, we don't really know that it could be Nitcha, the Tumah could be Nitcha, because who says that they were all Tamei? And certainly other people can't become Tamei from people, because you have Reva Kol Tamei with a Sofik Tumah, B'Shus HaYochid, which is Sveki Tamei, but Aliba de Emes, there's a Sofik. So therefore the first Mishalmi explained that it's talking about that they all became Tamei with the same Tumah. You have to have a tzir, that there was a Sofik Tumah, because it has to remain a Rishus HaYochid. Shayachid means there are not many people there. So all of the whole tzibur became Tamei with the same Sofik Tumah Rishus HaYochid. So mainly they're either all Tamei or all Torah. So mainly that's the case. Tzibur Shenitma B'Sofik Rishus HaYochid with the same Tumah. So then is Yasa Kulam Betumah, because if they're all Tamei, so then they have a din of Revat Tzibur Tamei and so the Teirim could do with the Tmeim. If they're all Torah, so there's also no problem, because they're all Torah, so maybe there's no problem. So then there's the din of Yasa Kulam Betumah. That's how the Mefarshim explain Pshat, the Maraparim, Yishalmi. But the Rambam, it doesn't say that. The Rambam is not so clear that that's the tzir of the Rambam. Tzir, or maybe it is Pashut, but Tzibur Shenitma v'Safik Rishus HaYochad means the one Tzibur was all Nitma with the same Safik Tum Rishus HaYochad. Okay, Allah Ches. Pesach Shikrivu B'Tumah is a Reza Nechel B'Tumah. Shemitchilose Libo El Lachila. Now there's a din that Tumah Hutra or Hutra B'Tzibur, so you doiche Tumah B'Tzibur, so Moshe of this, if the Keinim Atmeim, and you have to bring a Korban Tomid, or you have to bring a Korban Shlomim of Shalmi Tzibur on Shavuos, so you bring it B'Tumah, or a Chatos, you bring it B'Tumah, but you don't eat it. You bring it B'Tumah, you don't eat it B'Tumah. By Pesach, there's a special din, that since the Pesach is Libom Mitchilosi El Lachila, so then you could even eat it B'Tumah. That's this din. Pesach Shekrivu B'Tumah, Harei Nechel B'Tumah, Shet Mitchilosi Libo El Lachila. Und ve'eini nechel l'chol tamei, elo l'tmei mes, shenitris lem atum azeis, and here the Rambam adds, ulukiyetzi bem mitumi magatumis. That anyone that became tamei with magatumis could also eat the Korban Pesach. Thus, this fact that a Korban Pesach could be eaten betumah applies also to someone that was noga b'sheres, noga b'nevela, to magatumis. Avalat meim, shatumah yetz alei migufam, so this heter to eat this Korban Pesach B'Tumah applies also to all Tumei Maga. Now, even though other Tumei Maga aren't nichlal in the gather of the Tmei Mes to count if they're Rubam Tomei, because you want to count of the Rave is Tomei, so then the Rave is Tomei only applies if the Rave are Tomei Tmei Mesim. The fact that there's a miyot of that there are people that are Tmei Sheretz, and they're mitzdaref to the Tmei Mesim, so it's become Reiv Tomei, that's not going to make it a Reiv Tomei. And the din is also that someone that's a Tomei Sheretz, even if he's nimna on the Korban Pesach, and Mamela he's going to eat the Korban Pesach, but nevertheless he could not go into the Azora. He goes into the Azora, the Rambam says clearly, he goes into the Azora, he's Chayiv Kodesh, the Rambam Bias Mikdash, but nevertheless, there's a special heter that he's allowed to eat. He's allowed to be mitzdaref, to be a nimna on a Korban Pesach. Whereas if this Korban Pesach is boy betumah, and he's tamei, he could be nimna on the Korban Pesach and eat it betumah with this level of tumah. Mashenkin, the people that are zavim or the tumah yetzalei megufam, so then they can't be nimna, they can't eat the Korban Pesach. However, even though they're not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach, if they did eat the Korban Pesach, they're potter, because Mipiyashmol lamdu shanechel leteirim chayavun alei mishum tumah. Since they're mutal l'tmeim mes or l'tmeim maga, is ein chayav m'alei mishum tuva. Now we're saying another din that afilu achlu tmei mes mehei murim shalei. They're eating from the murim of the Korban Pesach. Now their heter to eat of the basar was really only the basar. The chlal the murim you're not allowed to eat. A person that eats the murim, which is supposed to be nikra l'gav mizbech, is aver and alav. But nevertheless, here is an extra thing of tumah. So we're saying since they're mutter to eat the basar betumah, so the isser of eating the imurim betumah goes off. That's what we're saying. Afilu achlu tmei amez me imurim shalei pturim, because once the isser tumah goes off from the basar, so the isser tumah goes off from the imurim. Although there's an isser to eat the imurim, they get malchus feeding the imurim. Amedvar mamurim she pesach yachal betumah shenit muat sibur kedem zikas adam. So no, there was a heter for this. There was zerik adam al atmeim, and then so the whole Pesach came betumah, so to speak. The Gemara of the Pesach came betumah, so then you could eat it betumah. Avlim nitmul achar zikas adam. In other words, they brought the Korban Pesach, and everyone was start, and there was zerik the dam, and now all of a sudden everyone became tamei. So then it's le'yochel, because the whole din, the din is you're allowed to bring the Korban Pesach betumah, and when you bring the Korban Pesach betumah, you could also eat it betumah. Mashayin over here, you didn't bring the Korban Pesach betumah, you brought the Korban Pesach betara. It was a regular Korban Pesach, and the people became tamei. So then it's a separate din, and they're not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. Halacha test, shachtuhu betara. Lepel, they shechted it while everyone was Torah. And lepel, the nitmu reivat tzibur, kedem zrika. Kedem zrika, so we had the case, kedem zrika, everyone became tamei. So then the din is zerik as adam. However, v'hapesach le'yochel. Why? Be'etzem, since lepel, they became tummy before the zrika, and the zrika was already on tmeim. So the zrika was the gemar kapar of the ikar of the Korban Pesach. So we made a little chura. The pashtus would be that be'etzim and ateda they should be able to eat it betuma as well. But over here, gzeira shemi yitamu achar zrika b'shon acheres v'yechlu betuma. So therefore, it's, if it was before the shechita, so it's clear here was before the shechita, and here was not before the shechita. Masha'inka, when you can say after the shechita, before the zrika, after the zrika, so that is not going to be so clear. So therefore, they were goyzer that even before the zrika, but if it was after the shechita, is le yachlu betuma. Hayu klisharis tmeim b'sheretz u'keyetzebei. You had klisharis which were tmeim b'sheretz u'keyetzebei. So be'emes, so lepel, it's going to come out that the basar is going to become tummy. It's going to become tummy. Now the question is, so if the basar is going to become tummy, and you're going to be allowed to use this Korban Pesach, this achidush. Because till now we're only learning that you're allowed to eat. The musig of tumah hutra b'tzibur is only, or tumah tchuya b'tzibur is only by a case of tmei mes. When you get tmei sheretz, you don't say tumah. You're not doicha the isur tumah, and memele you would do it b'sheni. That's a pashtus. By tmei sheretz, it's not din. It's just there's a din that once there was already that reiv or tmei mes, so they can be mitzaref also the tmei sheretz to eat from the Korban Pesach. That's this din of tmei sheretz. Now we're learning a new din that if l'moshel the klisharis with tmeim b'tuma sheretz, so l'chura that's the only tumah here. Nevertheless, so it's either do it or not do it. So the din is you're allowed to shech the basar, you're allowed to shech, go ahead and shech with klishar, use the klisharis which are tmeim, and that is going to be matam of the basar. That'll be matam of the basar, and it's mutter, and you'll be able to eat this basar which was tamei, which betumas klisha, because it became tamei through the klisharis which were tamei sheretz. But nevertheless, you're not allowed. That is not matter that the people that are tamei mes should be able to eat betumah. So even though Gans Klal Yisrael is eating betumah sheretz, but on the other hand, their sheretz, but on the other hand, only the Torah eat it, because there's a difference between eating basar tamei and a tamei eating basar. Eating basar tamei is isa laf. A tamei eating basar is isa kares. So in Mela, so the heter is only to eat basar tamei, but not the heter is for tmeim to eat. That's what the Rambam is going to say. Hoyu klisharis tmeim b'sheretz u'kiyetzebei is hail the ena metamnas adam k'meshi is bourbon came a klisharis which is tamei b'tuma sheretz is not going to be metam the adam. The klisharis has the din of a rishon l'tuma. The sheretz is a avatuma. The klisharis is a rishon l'tuma, and it's obviously not metam the adam. Is afal pisha metam misabasa, even though it's metam misabasa, so Mamela is coming out that this Korban Pesach is being eaten betuma because the basar is tamei. But nevertheless, leyasu ela tehirim, only tehirim should be involved in this Korban Pesach. Why? V'yachol afal pisha hu tamei, even though the basar is tamei. You should eat the basar even though the basar is tamei, the tehirim. Now the Rambam says mutiv sheyachol betumas basar she belav v'leichlu tumei. Tmei aguf shein bekaris. Tmei aguf which are bekaris, that's a much darker issa. So therefore, you eat it betumas basar she belav, but you don't eat it tmei aguf shein bekaris. Mishabiyan b'psula mikdoshim. Lashon mutav is a little bit hard to understand. The question is there a heter or isn't there a heter? What's this mutav? It's not the same people. The question is there are people that are eating betumas basar. Fine, mutav she. The tahirim are eating it betumas basar. Now the question is, could the tmeim eat it? Because since there was a certain heter, but obviously there was a heter over here to eat it, betuma, which normally a tuma wouldn't be allowed to eat, but there's a special heter because it cannot be eaten, this whole Korban Pesach cannot be eaten unless it's eaten betuma. So the question is, does that extend also to tumas guf? So we're saying, no, it doesn't extend. Lashon mutav is a little bit hard to understand. What's this lashon mutav?